Madrid-bound Flight 237, a Boeing 747, rose calmly into the azure sky. The passengers, comfortably seated in their seats, had no idea what was going to happen. The journey took place like any other, a smooth takeoff, regular announcements from the crew, and absent-minded glances at the clouds which slowly passed by, the blurred silhouettes of the Earth disappearing below the horizon. Tranquility reigned, as in a suspended dream. But suddenly something strange happened. After 2 hours of flight, a scream pierced the tranquility of the cockpit. It was a weak cry, almost a whisper, but enough to startle the young co-pilot, Francois. His hands, still nervous, tightened on the controls. The captain, Captain Rodriguez, looked up from the dashboard, his gaze fixed through the porthole, where a subtle but disturbing change caught his attention. A dark cloud was forming in the distance, at first insignificant, then growing larger and larger as the plane continued its trajectory. Inside this cloud, dark silhouettes loomed, like indistinguishable shadows that moved with strange coordination. "What the hell is that?" Captain Rodriguez whispered, his voice low, his eyebrows furrowed, his eyes narrowing to make out the blurred shapes that were rapidly approaching. He sat up straighter in his seat, his aviator instinct telling him that something unusual was happening. Birds. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, swooped in close formation, their wings beating in perfect synchronization, their direction clear. At first it might have looked like a simple cloud of insects or an ordinary phenomenon, but as the birds got closer, a certainty set in. This was no accident. The birds were diving towards the plane with impressive precision, as if they had a goal, a well-defined destination. Francois, the co-pilot, couldn't help but chuckle nervously, observing the birds as if they were the fruit of a bad omen. "Commander, do you see them? These birds," he said, his voice trembling, now a little higher. He turned his head towards his superior, his face bathed in a pale glow. The fear was palpable in his eyes. Captain Rodriguez, a man of great experience, paused before responding, his gaze still fixed on the dark figures approaching at high speed. "Yes, I see them." His words were short, measured, but they conveyed growing concern. He leaned forward, his fingers brushing the instruments, unknowingly adjusting the pressure in his palms. The birds were no longer at a safe distance. They were too close. Crows. There was no doubt about it. Their feathers were a deep black, with an eerie sheen, and their eyes glowed almost supernaturally, like bursts of phosphorescent light. These were no ordinary birds. Their wing beats created a strange, almost inaudible vibration, but each movement made them feel an abnormal, threatening presence. A muffled, light noise, like a breath of heavy air, filled the cockpit. "I don't know what they want, but I don't like it." "Not at all," Captain Rodriguez said in a low tone, his eyes still fixed on the creatures that seemed to accompany him on his way, closer with each moment. His gaze, normally so calm, betrayed this slight crack, this doubt that even he could not ignore. A shiver ran down his spine. He had never seen anything like it. He immediately made the decision to report the anomaly to the control tower, hoping that a rational explanation could ease his growing fears. In a firm voice, he spoke over the intercom. "Control tower, this is Flight 237. We have a strange situation. A formation of birds following us closely. We are requesting instructions." The response was almost immediate, but his tone only added to the growing anxiety that gripped the cockpit. "Flight 237, we have also received similar reports from several other aircraft in your area. Remain at a stable altitude and continue to follow your flight path. We are investigating the situation, but no emergency measures at this time." "Stay at a stable altitude," Francois repeated, his gaze on the radar. But as the birds got closer, he realized that the situation was far from being as simple as the tower's response suggested. The birds seemed to evolve with consciousness. A consciousness which, at every moment, pushed them more to surround the device. They were no longer simply creatures wandering in the sky, but a collective entity, imposing their presence. The formation that united them became denser and denser, their strange halo enveloping the plane, creating a field of disturbances. "Captain, I think they're following us." "They're not just flying around us," Francois said, his voice choked. "They're surrounding us." "Yes," Captain Rodriguez replied, his jaw clenched. "They are blocking our path." The birds were becoming more and more aggressive, approaching with alarming speed. The captain observed the black mass beyond the porthole. The air seemed denser around the plane, an invisible pressure on the wings. It felt like something bigger was brewing. "Radar! They're blocking the signal!" Francois cried, his growing panic piercing through the captain's apparent calm. Indeed, the onboard instruments displayed errors, the lines blurring in interference. The radar seemed to be faulty, unable to pick up signs of life in the air. At that moment, the plane began to shake. At first, it was a slight vibration, barely perceptible, like a shudder that ran through the metal structure of the Boeing 747. Then, as the seconds passed, this agitation became more violent, more irregular. The tremors intensified, shaking the plane with unexpected brutality. The birds were now so close that they were crashing into the hull of the plane. Their bodies, dark and massive, collided with blind violence, like a sea of black feathers battered by a storm. The sound of impacts echoed through the cabin with an eerie echo, each contact creating a dull vibration that shook the seats and resonated in the passengers' ears, anchoring a palpable terror in the air. The light from the onboard lights flickered, creating dancing shadows, as if the plane was caught in a bad dream. The passengers' murmurs grew louder, turning into nervous outbursts, muffled screams being heard throughout the cabin. No one understood what was happening, but everyone felt the imminent threat. A feeling of unease invaded the confined space of the plane, amplified by the destabilizing turbulence and this unexpected aggression coming from the birds. The latter, chained in their erratic flight, seemed animated by a will of their own, a sort of obscure force which kept them close to the fuselage. Captain Rodriguez, his face marbled with concentration, quickly turned his gaze to the co-pilot, concern etched on his features. "I have to land. Immediately." His voice was firm, but his tone carried a seriousness that left no room for doubt. "But, order an emergency landing when we don't know the origin of this disturbance," the co-pilot protested, his voice trembling, caught between the instinct to follow orders and the growing fear that was rising within him. The captain, implacable, turned his eyes towards the horizon of the ocean of clouds. He didn't need to think any further. The urgency was palpable, an intuition anchored in his aviator soul. The plane could not continue like this, diverted by these enigmatic creatures who, more and more, seemed to interfere with the onboard instruments. He turned the wheel sharply, beginning a downward trajectory. The plane tilted slightly, its engines reducing power as it headed toward a nearby airport, a haven where it could finally return to the ground safely. But then, in a sudden and unexplained change, the birds, which until then had pursued the plane like a silent and menacing shadow, disintegrated. They transformed, decomposing into a cloud of black smoke, a swirl of darkness that invaded the airspace. The atmosphere, already tense, took on an unbearable heaviness. The lights in the cabin flickered once more, as if the sky itself was closing in around the plane. A shiver of dread ran through the crew, a collective awareness of the presence of a phenomenon that defied all rational explanation. The black mist curled around the aircraft, materializing in a thick fog, while the sky, until then bright, was tinged with a deep, almost menacing gray. "What is this?" whispered the co-pilot, his eyes wide with anguish. "Prepare to land," the captain replied calmly, his face frozen in an expression that showed neither panic nor despair. He was a man accustomed to the unexpected, but never before had he been confronted with such a strange situation. Every fiber of his being felt that this meeting was neither natural nor accidental. Something bigger, older, was emerging behind this incident. But his duty was clear: bring the plane back to the ground, whatever the cost. When the wheels of the plane finally touched the tarmac with a brutality that shook all the passengers, the engines screaming as they braked the aircraft, an almost supernatural silence fell over the cabin. The plane stabilized with a shrill sound of brakes, and the passengers began to stand up, relief on their faces, but none of them seemed to want to break the heavy silence. The feeling of irrational fear persisted, a fear that none of the passengers seemed capable of expressing, a fear of an event that no one really understood but that everyone felt deeply. No one spoke about the incident. No words passed lips. The certainty of what they had experienced was only expressed through shifty glances and hesitant gestures. Only Captain Rodriguez remained on the trail, standing, eyes riveted on the now clear sky, scanning the horizon like a man who had received a revelation that he was not yet ready to understand. He had a hunch that these birds, these strange and disturbing creatures, were not just an anomaly in the sky. They carried a message. Or maybe a test. Perhaps they had been sent as a warning, or as a prelude to something larger and still unknown. The captain, his fists clenched around his uniform, stood there, observing the sky which had become calm again. But his mind was far away, beyond the clouds, in the unpredictable darkness of the universe. He knew that this event was only a first clue to a mystery that would only slowly unfold over time. But at that moment, he understood one thing. This meeting was not the result of chance. And he had a feeling that fate, or some unknown force, intended to call them back again.